It was interesting when we noted that only two of the Gospels covered Jesus' birth. And now, early in Jesus' ministry, when he performs the first miracle, the turning water into wine, and as we see him deal with Nicodemus, we find, and the turning of the tables at the temple, we find that these are only recorded in John, nowhere else, not Matthew, not Mark, not Luke, but John only. And so let's take a look at these events that were so important, but John is the only one that records them for us as we look at the chronological gospels. After Jesus has turned the water into wine, there's a very interesting verse, verse 11 of chapter 2, and it says, of these signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, manifesting his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Our faith has to grow, and his disciples' faith had to grow. And when they saw the water turn to wine, when they saw some of the things that he did in Cana of Galilee, it built their faith, and they believed stronger in him than ever before. And then as we move down in chapter 2 to verse 15 through 17, we find him having traveled more than 70 miles from Capernaum at the tip of the Sea of Galilee, all the way down to Jerusalem for the Passover. And it tells us that he made a scourge cord out of rope, and that he went into the temple where there were sheep and oxen and men who were changing coins for the local currency. And he overturned the tables and drove them out, saying, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." Now, there's a balance to everything, isn't there? And I remember in my church in Florida, we had a number of senior adults who felt that we should never sell any kind of merchandise inside the sanctuary, that we should sell it in the foyer, in the back of the church, but not in the place of worship, to not turn the place of worship into a place of business. There were some things that I felt that was being a little bit legalistic, and there were other things where I felt they were absolutely correct. The approach that some of those musicians that toured our church took to selling merchandise was making it a place of business. And there were other times when I felt like people just wanted to be a part of that ministry and wanted the convenience of being able to walk to a table and purchase the merchandise. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? And today, with most of your mega churches and even some of your smaller churches now having coffee shops within the foyer of the church, and they're allowed to take the coffee into the place of worship, take Coca-Colas and coffee and tea into the place of worship, along with even some snack foods. Not only is it bad stewardship from the standpoint of spills and staining carpet and pews, but you start to ask yourself, could we not spend an hour to an hour and a half in worship without having to have a beverage or something to eat? I have no problem at all having coffee and refreshments in a fellowship hall or even in a Sunday school classroom before class starts. Would have no problem with a vestibule set up so that people could have coffee before the service begins. But to bring those food items into the worship service, I believe, starts to smack at, are we making this a place of leisure for our personal pleasure and for business, rather than making it a place of worship? Well, you may or may not agree with that, but I just feel like the worship center should be just that. It should be a worship center. If somebody has to have some water because of a health condition, then let them bring a small plastic bottle of water into the worship service, keep it in their pocket or purse until such time as they need it, and then discreetly use it so they can continue to worship. But I believe the place of worship should be just that, a place of worship, not a place of business. Well, I digress. Chapter 2, verses 18 through 23 is a critical statement that was made that was actually used against Jesus when he was tried by the Sanhedrin, and here in the temple when he drove out the money changers and those who were selling the sacrifice animals. They said, show us a sign why you should be allowed to do this, to drive us out of here. And he said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. They talked about the fact that it took 46 years to build the temple and he was going to rebuild it in 3 days. But it clearly says in verse 21, but he was speaking of the temple of his body, so that when it was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Jesus had spoken. Isn't that neat? They remembered he made that statement, and then they realized he wasn't talking about the physical body of the temple, but he was talking about his own body being raised from the dead. And then finally, I think it's very, very important when we look at this section, is only recorded in John, that he deals with Nicodemus. And we don't have time to go into the whole story. You know it pretty well, I'm sure, from Sunday school teachings and so on. But there is something very interesting about the story about Nicodemus that we sometimes don't tie it all together. And that is that in the middle of the story of Nicodemus is John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Now, what I want to share with you is that I have a very dear friend in the ministry who used to have a phrase that he used frequently in his sermons. When it came to some hard things about the scriptures, he would say, somebody should have told you that. Somebody should have told you it wasn't going to be easy to be a disciple. They should have told you that there's judgment as well as grace and mercy. And he would say, they should have told you, they should have told you. Well, in John 3:16 through 21, we stop at usually John 3:16 and we leave out these verses. He who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe in him has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, but men loved darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, for the fear of his deeds will be exposed. Now listen, we need to tell them about the love of God. We need to tell them God so loved the world, but we also need to tell them that those that believe not are judged already. And we need to point out that the deeds, the evil deeds of man, will be brought to light by the light of the world, which is Jesus. But in the encouraging part in verse 21, it also reminds us that those that practice truth come to the light, so that their deeds may be manifest, not to glorify themselves, but listen to what it says, as having been wrought in God. That is, that God was the one that caused the good works in their lives. Well, that's my thought for the day. It's a lot of thought, isn't it? Recorded only in John. We need to be sure that we study those first couple of chapters as John chapter 2, verses 11 through chapter 3, verse 21. And I hope that you have a wonderful day.